Hello, and welcome to the referee's playbook, Avoiding the Red Card and the Sin Bin with Chris Haigh. If you haven't met Chris before, he is a pragmatic cybersecurity leader with more than 25 years' experience helping Australian organisations tackle real-world risk. As Chief Information Security Officer at Mercury IT, he's known for cutting through the noise and translating technical threats into cyber board-level decisions that actually get funded. With a career spanning red, blue, and purple teams, Chris brings a rare end-to-end view of how breaches happen, how they're stopped, and why reasonable steps must be defensible, not rhetorical. He argues that compliance done properly isn't a box to tick, it's leverage, the kind that protects customers, strengthens architecture, and holds up under regulatory scrutiny. Above all, Chris is focused on evidence over alarmism. He moves audience past the fear-driven security and into practical strategies that make risk visible, budgets justifiable, and outcomes measurable. Let's welcome him to the stage with a warm round of applause.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me in this presentation. Thought I'd give you a little bit of a background for those of you who have not met me, and I do see some familiar faces in the crowd, which is awesome. Nice to see you. I wanted to give you a little bit of background of myself, so you have an understanding of the thinking that takes place and then how this presentation actually came about. Because I come from a very technical background. I was a Microsoft systems engineer. I trained engineers across South Africa, that's the slight accent that you're hearing, and the UK and the US. And once I had kind of finished the server side of things, I thought networking sounds cool. So I went into the Cisco side of things. I did a CCIE in routing switching. And again, I trained engineers across Europe, so your CCNAs, CCNPs, and CCIEs, to develop networking and complex networking for banking environments. I did a bit of red teaming off the back of that, and then essentially sold that business out in the UK, and then moved to Australia about 16 years ago. For the last 15 years, I've been working with Mercury IT on the Gold Coast. They've been around for 22 years, and they're a managed service provider. Now, in the last about 8 years, I've focused purely on the cybersecurity side of things. So how do we translate cybersecurity? So essentially what happened is I came from a very technical background and then ended up having to speak to a lot of business owners, boards, budgets, risk positions. So, and that's why I wanted to speak to you and how this sort of talk came about, because it was a little bit of frustration. And I'm sure anybody sitting in that same position, you know, whether you're a CISO, you're an IT manager, or you're just part of that team that's got to justify the budget, right? How do I get that tool, that new process or new person into your team, right? How do you get that across? So it's translating that technical language that actually becomes very, very important. And I think a lot of us, certainly I still do, struggle with some of that. So what I wanted to do was go through some of the cases that have actually come up last year and at the beginning of this year, and actually starts to give you a little bit of more detail. I don't know how many of you saw Hank's presentation yesterday. It was a great presentation. And a lot of what he said rang true as well. You know, being in that CISO position and talking to the business and trying to find out what's important to them and then bring that across. And he had an important point. He basically said that you can't tell the business what their crown jewels are, right? You just can't. They tell you, right? And then you take that and you translate that from a technical perspective. However, there is a bit of nuance in that I wanted to actually cover as well with this. Because I can tell you one thing, is the customer's data that tends to be collected, from my experience, at a board level, a owner level, etc., is not normally thought about, right? When we start talking about crown jewels, Like if you're looking at banking, for instance, it's the integrity of the data, making sure the money in the account's accurate, right? And if we're talking about another business, it might be uptime, right? Now, they might be collecting information and data from users, and that's part of it. But what they don't see is that losing that becomes a problem, right? So the idea here is for you to actually take that information and translate it for them and bring it back to their actual crown jewels. So show how that fits in. And where this became kind of important for me was looking at these cases. If you look at the Privacy Act, it's very old, right? It's been there since the 80s, and it pretty much affects every business. But where it started getting some teeth was actually in February 2018. If you recall, that's when you had the notifiable data breach, right? And it started having fines attached. And from my perspective, I was like, that's great, right? That actually shows a little bit of more rigor to a business of why you would have an incident response plan, as an example, right? Why should you care? Well, you should care because there's a $2.1 million fine attached to it, right? But as I'm sure most of you in the room will remember, what happened? Nothing, right? Absolutely nothing happened. We kind of, 6 years on, 7, 8 years on, and we're still kind of waiting what's happening. And that's why this came up. I was like, hold on a second. Okay, so what we've got is we've actually now have some court cases around this where a company has been brought in front of a federal judge to actually determine what this information looks like. Because as practitioners, as probably most of you in the room, will sit there, look at the legislation. You're not necessarily a lawyer, or you might be. That'd be cool as well, right? And you see the term reasonable steps. You're like, okay, so how do I translate reasonable steps to an organization? How do I get it across, right? Because whatever I say, that's just what I'm saying. And being a managed service provider, most of the time I'm just trying to sell something, right? Although I don't do sales. So this is where we get to. It's going, right, okay, I now have a judge that's actually listed in black and white in court documents what reasonable steps look like. Now, obviously you can't take this just verbatim and go, here, that's what you need. It depends on the business. It depends on what information is being collected. Now, for those of you not familiar, I just want to run through these cases that I've selected that have come up. There's two that relate to the Information Commissioner, so around the Privacy Act. So that would be the App 11.1 is the one that we're looking at. And what's actually happened there, right? So if you've not read about it, the Australian Clinical Labs, one of the largest pathology companies in Australia, bought MedLabs. Now, timings, dates, etc., you can look up if you want to. I'll give you a general gist of what actually happened. So MedLabs systems were below par, right, from an IT perspective of what Australian Clinical Labs was. So different endpoint protection, for instance, patching of systems weren't quite where they should be. Now, a lot of this should have been picked up in the due diligence process, right, in the mergers and acquisitions piece, right? And this came out in the court documents as well. So that transaction actually happened in December, right? And then move on only 2 months. By February, they were already ransomwared, right, by the Quantum Group. So the Quantum Group demanded money. Obviously, MedLabs being the smaller went to their now owners, the ACL, and go, what do we do? They went to their managed service provider or their managed security service provider and said, can you have a look at this? There was one day, that they had a look over it and came back and went, it's a scare tactic. There's no evidence of any data exfil. How many have heard that one, right? So, interesting. So, unfortunately, a couple of weeks later, their CIO went to the board and said, there's no need to panic. We don't have any evidence of data being exfiltrated, right? Again, heard that one before. The problem here is that the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the ACSC, warned them 4 days before he delivered that information to the board, saying that they've got information via the third-party network that data had been exfilled. So that it's an interesting choice. I probably wouldn't have made that choice, but I don't work there. Moving on from that, about 2 weeks later, after he delivered that message into the board, right, they get another message from the ACSC going, we can confirm that there's about 80 gigs of data on the dark web, right? And then, of course, the ball starts rolling, but still very slowly. It took about another month for them to actually notify the Information Commissioner. It took them almost another 2 months for a public apology to take place. All of this, of course, ended up in the court documents. And those of you not familiar, $5.8 million fine, so actual civil penalty fine. That was split up in a number of ways. In fact, there was $400,000 on top of that for court costs as well. But they split it up into like $800,000 for not doing a proper enough investigation. It was $800,000 for notifying late, right? And then the other like kind of 4.2 was just, you know, breaches and negligence. Right? So serious interference with the people's information at the end of the day, right? So immediate financial hits, obviously some reputational harm off the back of that. So that is Australian Clinical Labs. It's about a 76-page document. I'm not going to do all the work for you. Some of it's here. Do go read the documents if you're interested. It's actually kind of good how they've listed it all out, and you can actually see the failures. Vinomofo is an interesting one. It was an online wine retailer, as you can tell by the name, sort of. And what happened here is that there wasn't any civil penalty here, so there was no fine. But the interesting thing is, in the investigation from the Information Commissioner, they actually put binding declarations on, though. So, you know, you can argue that it's not as bad, but it is quite when you've got 90 days to then put in what they've told you to put in, like logging and et cetera, and I'll get into the details on that in a second. So, and on top of that, within 6 months, right, they would have to have an independent review of what that looked like, right? On top of that, they would have to submit that review to the Information Commissioner within 14 days of receiving it, and then they would have to act on what was missing in that review as well. So quite a few bits and pieces. So they had cultural negligence, and I'll point out what those are as we go forward. Now, in the lead up to this talk, I chose kind of these two cases because the information privacy is quite a thing for me. I speak to my customers a lot about it. But another one that came up was FIG. So FIG Securities, I thought I'd throw this in kind of last minute around because there are financial services and license holders, and these have started to come up. And what happens here is there's a different regulator involved, which is interesting. So it's not just the Information Commissioner now. Now we've got to have a look at ASIC, right? And the Corporations Act. So in this case, we've got the Corporations Act S912A actually comes up as well. And it starts getting into directors' duties and so forth. Now, in this particular case, again, you can go read the case documents. What's happened here is that they have written out some of their policies and then not followed what those policies said. So that's kind of interesting, and we'll get into the details on that as well. So $2.5 million fine there from ASIC, right? And it's interesting because it's a case of, right, is the Information Commissioner going to go after them as well? The deficiencies, I'll just kind of rattle through them very briefly here so you can see what kind of things that they found in the investigation over it was a 4-year period that they were looking at, 4 years and 3 months. I mean, Eternal Blue, that's an interesting one, right? WannaCry, and it's not patched, right? Admin accounts used for non-privileged tasks, no vulnerability scanning. Is this sounding familiar? It should. It's Essential 8, right? So Essential 8 is interesting. In this particular court document, they listed that they weren't following stuff like Essential 8, right? ISO 27001, NIST, CSF, and the ISM. Those are the 4 that were mentioned as frameworks that would be relevant, right, to a company delivering this sort of data. So there's one that you can look at as well. No security awareness training. We're just talking about culture and stuff. Absolutely important. It's a big one. I do a lot of training, mostly for boards these days, but around that. Because you're trying to set the culture at the top, right? And bring it back down the system so it all stays relevant. No MFA. Yeah, interesting. Password stored as plain text on the network. Also interesting. Incident response plan, no incident response plan in place. And the IT security delegated. So what they picked up in this particular court case, which you might find interesting if you hold a certification, right? So if you've done like a CISSP or something like that, right? This particular court document actually listed out non-certified individuals trying to look after cybersecurity, which I thought was interesting that they brought that up. Obviously, they didn't dig into whether those people actually had the skills or not. What they did point out is that the CIO didn't have time to actually deal with it. Right, so that 1.2 million to fix the problems is actually in the court document. They actually did the calculations. So 1.2 million. The problem is they had spent about 1.5 million dealing with the court case leading up to this. Then on top of that, get the $2.5 million fine. And then on top of that, about $500,000 in dealing with costs for the court. So a lot going on. So this is what I wanted to point out here is, and I'm not a lawyer, again, as per the first slide, right? But you actually have 2 different regulators to deal with. And whether you get dragged into court from both of them, I'm not 100% sure how that would work, potentially. If you look at how the Information Commissioner works on fines, right, that are now potentially in excess of 50 million, right, it's per contravention, so per breach. So if you've got 200,000 records that have been breached, they could fine you for every single one. And you might be thinking, that seems ridiculous. Right, ACL, right, so Australian Clinical Labs, the court document list, that was the 5.8 million. That court document lists, right, 495 billion and 60 million as the total that they could have been fined. In black and white, in the court document, right? So they're not mucking around. All right, so obviously I can't go through everything that they found. There's lots, right? I do have a handout though. I've created a PDF. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll more than happily send it to you. And that will actually break it down a little bit more on what comes out. So in this particular talk, I thought I'd just break out some of the more interesting ones and highlight them for you. I find I talk about these things more often than not to some of my customers. First, Australian Clinical Labs, the key one that they had was logging was a problem, right? Basically, they had no centralized logging. And the problem here was that the logging was default. In other words, overriding logs on a firewall, so they only ever had about an hour to deal with. So that, as you know, I'm sure, it does not help you. It can't help you in this case. So centralized logging was a theme that actually came up, right, for Australian Clinical Labs. And it also came up for Vinomofo, which is why I thought I'd bring it up. So in this case, Vinomofo, what they did is, Clinical Labs got ransomware. Vinomofo had the same sort of situation take place, whereby they were doing a database transformation exercise, right? So they moved, right, or copied their live data, you can see where this is going, onto a temporary AWS server. And they were like, oh, well, this is just an old server. And it was pre all the standard kind of security things you would have in place, right? Like your VPCs and all the general things you would normally put in, logging and so forth, wasn't enabled. So what you had is almost 1 million accounts, people's data, right? Sitting there, it was about like 900 and something thousand accounts, and that all got taken. So it took a couple of months. It was sitting on an unsecured AWS server, and obviously a threat actor came along and went, "Oh, that looks interesting. I'll just take that," and then started selling it on the dark web, right? So they, again, had to tell the information commissioner. They had started their investigation, and that's how we got to this mess, right? So in AWS, they had no CloudTrail logged in. They didn't have a SOC. They had nobody monitoring anything. So it all got taken, and they didn't even know. They only knew when it popped up on the dark web, right? So that's why I wanted to bring this one up first. So having the blindfolded goalkeeper sitting there trying to save a problem, and you're blind. And it's exactly what I tell my customers when I speak to them. Without a kind of a SIEM in place, centralized logging, or a SOC to actually deal with the problems, right? You're not seeing the problem until it's too late, right? So it is going to interfere with your way to get better. So again, just to point out on Essential 8, does point out about centralized logging. This is in maturity level 2, generally, is where the logging starts to play a part. The next part that I wanted to bring out was the temporary trap. And this was the Vinomofo issue as well. And it kind of crosses over to ACL a little bit in that they moved a bunch of data over into AWS, right? And did not secure it. So even though it was real data. With ACL, they basically did an M&A, so your mergers and acquisition did not go through the proper checks of that network or ignored it, one of the two. So, and I could kind of see, again, I didn't work there, but I kind of see how this would play out, where it's a case of going, oh yeah, they're behind on patching, they don't have the best EDR system in place, and they go, that's fine, let's connect it and we'll roll it out. But the problem hit in 2 months, right? That's all they had. So if that technical team was stretched, they might not have been able to catch up and get all those things in place before the problem actually hit, right? So there's an argument here from an M&A perspective of making sure there's a kind of go, no-go during due diligence before we actually bring that network on. So migrating data, any kind of temporary, if it's got actual live data in or a copy of it, you have to treat it like a production system, right? So get everything you would normally have in front. So any kind of protections you'd have on production, you would also move over. Culture. We've seen this come up a couple of times this week. Vinomofo had on their website with the listed as the boring stuff, right, when it got to their privacy notifications. In fact, it said, we're impressed with your commitment, but the good stuff is up there, buddy, with a little pointy emoji, right? The judge was not happy with that comment at all, as you can imagine. So what they took that as was a systemic failure of culture, not actually taking the privacy of their customers seriously enough. So, and again, not an ideal situation. Fig was another one. Again, it was almost like, well, we've got a security policy. I'm like, great. Has anyone read the security policy? Is anyone following the security policy? So it was almost like a case of, well, the paper that we have is going to save us. And that's not the case. In fact, what happened there is that they brought the paper out as evidence, going, this is what you said you do, and you haven't done it, right? So it will be used directly against you if you don't actually follow the processes and policies you put in. Which kind of gets us back to another interesting one, and it's our kind of final quarter here, is looking at where you told that there's a problem, right? So you might have an external audit or something comes up where you're actually have the knowledge that there's a problem. So in this particular case, there was a formal security audit report a full year before the problem. So again, what's happening is, and I say, the players played on. You given the warning and they just continue. Again, a judge frowns upon this pretty heavily, where it's a case of, right, if you know about it and you haven't done it in X amount of time, it's a problem. In this case, Vinomofo blamed COVID and the lockdowns in Melbourne. I was like, but we were locked down. And the judge was like, I could see the years here, right? I know there were lockdowns in 2020. We are talking about 2022. You had 2 years to get this done. That's a problem, right? FIG, same sort of problem, right? There was a lot of evidence that came up where there were systemic failures, right? Systems not being patched, too old. Again, we start talking about technical debt, right? So looking at that and where that fits in and fixing it. So again, it's about this awareness, right? But then not actually acting upon the issue. So as soon as it's documented, the clock is ticking. If anything happens and it ends up in court, it becomes evidence A. In this particular case, I would definitely look at speaking to your risk committee is a good one. If you don't essentially get in front of the board to speak to them, another very good one is your risk officer or your risk committee, and start working with the risk committee to get to the board, right? Because you can try and handle that translation through them. So the costs of losing here, I think, are pretty obvious. 5.8 million, that's the highest we've seen so far. It was interesting, I was at CyberCon last year, and I got to go to one of the talks. I think it was a panel discussion, which was great. It had their lead investigator from the Information Commissioner on the panel, and he went, this will be the smallest one you see. And they had a lot in the pipeline. I was like, well, that's interesting. From a sin bin perspective here, it wasn't a penalty, right? But the penalty kind of came out that you were bound by certain actions that you had to do. Like they essentially had to hire people and get things in place. And it kind of works out the same. Yes, Australian clinical labs had to do that, plus they got the fine, so either way. So fraction of the cost here is putting in some of the items I've already mentioned. Okay, and that's something you can take away. Some of the bits and pieces that we've been speaking about. Like I said, it's some of the bits I've just picked out from personal experience, but logging, something like a 24/7 SOC, a lot of people go, oh, it's too expensive. It really isn't these days, right? There's a lot of good partners out there that can handle a 24/7 SOC, and it doesn't cost the earth. It's not the same as it used to be, where it's going to be 50 grand minimum, and it's like, how? I've only got 25 seats. Okay, it doesn't quite work like that anymore. So definitely have a look into that, right? Rebranding your temporary is something I've pointed out as well. So universities, etc., standing up temporary servers, testing stuff. Check what the data is. If it's anything like production data, you need to put in the correct protections. M&A, mergers and acquisitions, a very hot topic in Australia for some reasons. So it definitely happens, and it's making sure that the technical teams are represented there, right? What are the risks before we actually connect this to our network? Like I said, I've got a PDF for you where I've mapped out some of the items that were found in the court document, so what came out from the court document, and I've mapped this against NIST CSF for you and Essential 8. Like that top one there, application whitelisting was actually listed in the court document against ACL as an example, so that can actually be used as well. Otherwise, that is pretty much me. I think I've done okay for Tom. Awesome. So we'll have time for some questions. Yes.
Fantastic. You have given me a great playbook on what to keep me awake at night time.
So, got a question around the fines and other things that are coming out. Do you think that, given the potential for vastly increased fines for companies and all that, that would, in a bad way, encourage companies to then quietly pay attackers and sweep this under the rug in such a way that it doesn't sort of gain the eye of the regulator so they don't get caught with this massive fine?
Look, it's a great question, and yes, of course. People are people. There are businesses that do and don't play by the rules, I suppose. Bear in mind, we have a new legislation in place that makes sure that you have to tell the regulator if you are paying the fine. Some of the big problems here, and I think a lot of businesses kind of miss this until they speak to their legal counsel about paying the fine. And this comes out to aiding and abetting terrorism or a sanctioned entity, and that is a huge one. So as someone that might speak to a business and they're thinking about it, like just maybe again, I'm not a lawyer, but this does happen. You know, you could be facing prison time if you've paid an entity that's sanctioned. So that's one. Will they still do it? Yeah, I'm probably pretty sure that they would actually. So, but hopefully we can give enough information. Remember here, you still have to translate this for business. Like, look, if you just took this as is and went as a list and went, you need to do this because a court said so. Again, it looks like a scare tactic, right? Like that's not really gonna work. So you do need to translate it again back to that piece that affects their business and then why that bit is important, right? So.
All right, another question. Do you see any sort of minimum standards? Like I'll talk to a business and all that, and a lot of them will come to me, what's the minimum that I have to do in order to avoid not getting in trouble?
I suppose that's a little bit about building this presentation, right? You know, before this, these court cases, what would we use as practitioners? I would use something like NIST CSF. I'd use Essential 8 for more of the technical controls, I suppose. So NIST is a nice, rounds out everything, like it's got governance and you know, cyber awareness training, which Essential 8 does not, right? But Essential 8's got some of the technical controls that you'd expect to be in place, you know, whether that is application allow listing or logging or MFA or something along those lines. So minimums. Minimums are a difficult one because it comes down to the budget. The only thing I would say is most companies are going to say they don't have budget. It's the default response. So you've got to give them enough of a reason. And I think, you know, for us, and speaking to a board, a company owner, or anything like that, is you've got to get across what the potential risks are to their business if they don't have X, Y, Z, whatever you've chosen, right? Because it's not always the same thing. Like a lot of the conversations I have are putting in a SOC, a SIEM in a SOC, but that's only because they've already got MFA and they've got their password management sorted and they've got some of the other fundamentals in place. If I go to a business and they've got nothing in place, I'm not going to go, here, have a SOC. Like that doesn't quite work at that stage because it's a bit of a journey. So I suppose your minimums are dependent on where they are with the maturity and then what the next risk is that's on the table, right? So, sorry, that's not a, here's your top 10.
I think
Perfect.
But from like a legal or legislative point of view,
Yeah.
if I can say, as a minimum, you must have X, Y, Z.
Yeah, look, and the interesting thing is if you take something like the ACL case, it's about health information. So it's quite high on the list. And the other one is like FIG. It's about financial information, also very high on the list. So it would be pretty easy, I would say, for any of us to grab that court case, pull out the details, and go, here is the minimum list, right? It's like you've got 100,000 clients. Like something I did, which I thought was quite interesting, is take ACL, take the fine, and divide it by the 225,000 records there are. It works out at about $18 a record. So now you could go to a business. How many clients do you have? Well, what's in your database? This much, times it out and go. That is probably the minimum fine that you would face if you lost the data.
Fantastic. Some really great recommendations there. Thank you so much for getting up there and sharing
Awesome.
it. It was enthralling.
Thank you so much. Connect on LinkedIn, and I'll be able to send you the documents.